So real quick about myself, I'm a certified floodplain manager and a climate change professional. And I've worked in stormwater management and floodplain management for over 20 years. And I also work in water and wastewater. So I know a lot about water. I'm a meteorologist by education, and I'm just going to get started here because I've got a lot of slides. Let me get started here. So our Sustainable Naperville 2036 report gave many actions to reduce our emissions, but we also need to adapt to the impacts of climate change that's already occurring and that will continue to occur in the future. I'm going to start with some climate data to show you how the climate is changing, then how our climate is impacting our infrastructure, and finally talk about how to create flood resilient infrastructure. So we know there's a positive correlation between greenhouse gases and global temperatures. And the warming will continue for about a decade, even if we halt all emissions tomorrow. We need to make aggressive emission reductions to make that obviously happen. And the reason why we will continue to warm is because these gases retain heat for decades or centuries, depending on the compound. In this slide, you can see carbon dioxide stays in our atmosphere for 50 to 200 years, methane a little shorter, and some of those H gases and F gases stay in there for literally thousands of years. So that's a problem. And according to the International Panel on Climate Change, we've already warmed more than 1 degree Celsius. And if all the commitments made at COP26 are fully implemented, we are still projected to reach 1.8 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. So right now we're on this high carbon pathway, and it looks like we're headed towards 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So now I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between climate change and extreme weather. Extreme events are shifting the probability of our averages. I like to think about extreme events like home runs in relation to a batting average. So when your favorite baseball player starts taking steroids, starts hitting more home runs out of the park, his batting average increases too. So climate change is like steroids for our atmosphere. And NOAA has compiled temperature averages by each decade. We can see that we are much warmer now than any time since modern record keeping began. Climate change is already happening. And we can see a similar pattern with the climate becoming wetter. So what's the correlation between temperature and rainfall? For every degree Celsius we increase, our atmosphere holds 7% more water vapor. And with the projected increase of nearly 2 degrees Celsius, our atmosphere will contain 14% more water vapor, which is why heavier rainfall is becoming more common. So zooming into Illinois, we see a greater number of heavy rainfall events occurring, which is also causing our flood problems. We are already dealing with these impacts of climate change in my field. So this graphic shows the average annual precipitation in Illinois. The trend line shows that annual amount increasing. We derive design frequencies from this record because engineers aren't going to analyze the entire record when we design a storm sewer. So what exactly is a design storm? It's a hypothetical storm derived by statistical analysis of the historic record. For each probability of occurrence, there is a specific rainfall depth and duration. The 100-year storm is more rare than 10-year storm. And the 100-year design storm here looks a lot different than, say, Houston, Texas. So engineers typically use the 10-year chance, or the 10-year storm, as it is commonly called, to design storm sewers. One advantage of looking at design storms for different years is comparing how our precipitation is changing over time. So we've had 3 design storm studies here in northeastern Illinois, the first in 1960, then 1989, and then most recently in 2019. All frequencies have been increasing as we would expect and consistent with average annual rainfall increasing. So let's compare that 2019 data to the 1989 data. So over that 30-year period, every frequency has increased. The 10-year storm increased by 15%, which is approximately a 0.5% increase annually. So these graphics here show what our temperatures and precipitation may be by mid-century and late century. The top row shows if we rapidly reduce our emissions, and the bottom row is business as usual. I probably won't be around in 2021 or 2100, but my grandchildren will be. So I'm pretty concerned when I see these kinds of graphics. So let's switch over and talk about infrastructure. What is infrastructure? So infrastructure is everything a society requires to function. It's our roads, our bridges, electricity, drinking water, wastewater, and buildings. And climate resilient infrastructure is just that withstands extreme weather and climate trends. So on the right or on the left here, we see flooding, and then on the right, we see a road that buckled due to extreme heat. So our federal government tracks the damages to our infrastructure that's caused by natural disasters. I would like to think of this as the financial cost of inaction. You can see here that since 1980, that our damages have been increasing exponentially. So it's important to understand the reasons why our damages have increased. It is due both to the number of extreme weather events that are occurring and a greater number of people living in areas where these extreme events occur. Here is a population change for the US from the last decade. And you can see that people are moving to areas that typically have hurricanes, tropical storms, sea level rise, wildfires, droughts, and of course the whole country has problems with flooding because anywhere it can rain, it can flood. So we build more infrastructure to accommodate people moving places, and we just put ourselves and our infrastructure at greater risk. And each year, NOAA lists the number of disasters that cost $1 billion or more. In 2021, we had $20 billion events, totaling $145 billion and killing nearly 700 people. Hurricane Ida alone cost $75 billion. In 2020, we had a new record number of events set, which was 22. And Northern Illinois is also impacted by these extreme weather events. Here, flooding causes the most damages, and I've listed some of the most recent events and their damages. There's different weather scenarios that cause each one of these events. The 1996 flooding, for example, was caused by thunderstorms that just stayed over the area and kept dumping rain. In 2008, the remnants of Hurricane Ike dropped over 8 inches of rain. And the Metropolitan Mayor Caucus Climate Action Plan identifies extreme heat and increased precipitation and flooding as our region's biggest risks. So I'm going to focus on flood risk to our infrastructure. So what does heavy rainfall do to our infrastructure? Heavy rainfall creates higher flows and faster moving water, which erodes the banks of rivers and lakes. It also washes out culverts and overtops bridges. So fixing erosion or washed out roads is very expensive. Heavy rainfall also overwhelms our storm sewers, resulting in flooding, especially in low-lying areas. I think, every time we have a big rain, you just hear that one of the all these different underpasses or viaducts in Chicago are closed, or water rescues. I think I just saw one last week because of the flooding that just happens there. So communities can spend millions of dollars trying to fix their flooding problems, and flooding is expected to increase unless we take action. Stormwater also leaks into our sanitary sewers, which causes them to backflow at weak points in the system, usually a manhole or a basement drain connection. No one wants raw sewage floating in their basement. Cleaning up and replacing damaged items, especially appliances, can be very expensive. So being resilient means we try to minimize our future disruptions by building better upfront. In terms of flooding, mitigation means reducing future risks by removing ourselves from Mother Nature's path. Adapting includes building barriers to limit the hazards impacts from reaching the structure, such as a levee or flood wall. So there are many protective measures that can be used to lower our risk. I'm not going to go through each one of these measures listed in the chart, but I just want you to know that there's many options available out there depending on the hazard. The problem we've created is being reactive, not proactive. We spend more money on recovery than preparation in what is called the disaster recovery rebuild cycle. For every dollar spent building better now, we avoid $6 in damages in the future. So let's talk about solutions. To recap, engineers design infrastructure expected to function for 20 to 50 years or more in the future using the historic data. But our climate is changing, and the historic data does not contain all the possible extreme events or the trends of the future. Engineers have adjusted regulations over time. Stormwater regulations were written 25 years ago. Before that, they didn't exist. Everyone just did whatever they wanted. Now is the time to change how we design our infrastructure so that it will be more climate resilient. So how do we create climate resilient infrastructure? I think we can use climate model projections to look ahead at how our infrastructure may be impacted 25, 50, or more years into the future. When we build infrastructure, we expect that it functions for a certain number of years. This is referred to as the design life. For example, buildings last 100 years, roads 25 to 50, and sewers 75 years. We can use the climate projection year that corresponds to that design life. The Federal Highway Administration has a tool to extract climate model projection data for design purposes. This has been around since about 2013. There are 21 different scenarios of climate data that are currently available. There's also some new data sets coming from Argonne, the 5th National Climate Assessment, and NOAA. Because there's so much data available, I recommend regional planning agencies such as CMAP or counties take the lead to establish a future conditions data set for the region, working with regional climate centers, the state climatologists, or scientists at universities to determine which of those scenarios best represent our anticipated future conditions. So there's $50 billion over the next 5 years that is earmarked for climate resiliency in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I've listed some here for your reference. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a lot of money out there. And when we rebuild these things, we need to build them correctly. So let's take a look at some local examples here in Naperville. Naperville is in the red circle on this watershed map, which shows Naperville is near the downstream end of the West Branch DuPage River watershed. 6 miles of the river runs through Naperville from north to south. There's 123 square miles of land that's draining to downtown Naperville. So higher flows are expected due to the cumulative effect of increased rainfall across the entire watershed. And floodplain is the land adjacent to the waterway that becomes inundated during high flows. It's important to avoid development in the floodplain because we know that that's where our flood damages occur. So FEMA conducted a study to look at our floodplains and how they will change due to climate change and population growth. Finding floodplains are projected to increase in size by 45% due to climate change and land use. More people will be living in the floodplain later on in the future, which also translates to more flood damages. If you follow the news, you may have heard many times over the year how the National Flood Insurance Program is not solvent. They're always in debt. They're trying to get debt forgiven, those kinds of things. So basically what they're charging for premiums right now doesn't cover what they're paying out in claims for flood damages. So future rainfall values can also be used in existing hydrologic and hydraulic models to see the extent of the future floodplain. So in these images, the blue shading shows the current floodplain, the yellow year 2050, and the red 2100. The image on the left shows a channel that can handle additional flows without flooding the adjacent land. The image on the right shows a channel that cannot accommodate those additional flows and floods a large area near the river. This information can be useful for communities so they can make decisions regarding setbacks from the river, development restrictions, future flood insurance needs, and potential buyouts. So what happens when a property is damaged substantially? Many times the government, or repeatedly, the government will come in and they will fund, along with the local partner, which sometimes it's the city or the county, and they will buy the house and basically knock it down and just let that land flood. And so I did work on the buyout program when I worked at DuPage County. So I think, hundreds of houses within DuPage County have been bought out through this program, a lot of them in Lisle near the East Branch. So we can also look at these floodplain maps to identify our vulnerabilities. Here's a map where the West Branch crosses under Ogden Avenue in Naperville. You see there's a nursing home there on the left side of the page, and they may have vulnerable population that needs to be evacuated a day or so before a large flood. They may be in a situation where they don't want their lower level of their facility to flood or be impacted by floodwaters. On the right side of the image is the wastewater pumping station, the fire station, and an electrical substation. So these are all critical facilities that a flood may disrupt their operations. If Ogden is flooded and fire trucks have to find another route, it may delay their response time. And here's some images from downtown Naperville. So the image on the left shows Eagle Street and City Hall. And so how would a flood disrupt services at City Hall? And on the right, we see Washington Street, which is the route for ambulances heading to Edward Hospital. What if the road flooding was deep enough to make it impossible to pass through there? So talking about Washington Street Bridge, it will be replaced very soon. So when replacing a structure such as this, it's the perfect time to ask some important questions, such as, is this bridge a critical route? Should it be elevated so floodwaters will not overtop it? How old is the modeling data that we're basing these decisions on? Is there a future flood conditions model available to show us if that road will frequently flood in the future? So let's talk about sewers, which drain our roads and convey our wastewater. Sewers are affected by increases in rainfall from climate change. Recall that sewers are designed for the 10-year rainfall and expected to function for 75 years in the future. Because of the lag in updating design values, sewers may be undersized to convey today's rainfall. So here's a great example. If a sewer is designed and built in 2018, the 1989 data would be used because that was the most recent data that's available. So when the data is updated the following year, the sewer is still expected to handle those increased flows. Based on the design life, the sewer is expected to last to 2093 and convey the 2050 flows as well as anything else that comes after that. And there's about a 1.5-inch difference in what we designed for and what the sewer is expected to convey. If the sewer lacks the capacity to handle the future flows, then flooding occurs. So my suggestion is to run the future conditions rainfall to see which segments of the sewer system will lack capacity in the future. Only these segments should be increased in size. We don't want to just upsize everything because it would just be really expensive. And we have a similar situation for our detention basins, as they will no longer provide the 100-year protection as our climate continues to change. Due to where they're usually located, they're surrounded by homes and roads, and there's little opportunity to expand them in the future to hold more water. I recommend every community create an adaptation plan to address the impacts of extreme weather and climate change. I suggest revising ordinances to use future conditions rainfall data, avoid development in high-risk areas, avoid development in and create an action plan to break the disaster recovery rebuild cycle. So in conclusion, I recommend a holistic, proactive approach Ensure that those net zero buildings won't flood. Protect your roads from flooding and buckling from extreme heat. Make sure your critical facilities are safe from all the hazards and have backup power supply. And I will share these slides on my LinkedIn profile if you'd like a copy. And with that, I'm finished, and I can open it up for some questions.
Anybody have any questions? That was terrific, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let's open it up. Anyone have any questions?
I have a question. Chris, what are the big issues along these lines in Naperville that we're facing?
Well, we're facing all of them because we've got the river that runs through the entire town and through the entire city rather. And then we've got storm sewers everywhere draining all of our roads, all, you know, these detention basins in the newer neighborhoods. So, you know, Naperville has everything that I talked about in here.
What about like building codes to prevent building on floodplains? Is that something that happens here or is discussed?
Yes, so we have floodplain management ordinances that we have to follow. It's actually DuPage County's ordinance, and all the communities have to follow those. We can actually add to that ordinance and be more strict. So we could say, you know, if you're going to build near the river, you need to be 50 feet away instead of 20 feet away from where the floodplain is. Or we can say we want you 3 feet above the water elevation instead of 2 feet. So, you know, we do have the ability to be more strict, but we do have to follow their ordinance otherwise.
Chris, do you have any suggestions for existing developments, like you showed retention ponds in like established neighborhoods, and that potentially in the future those retention ponds won't be good enough? Are there any solutions for that?
You know, that's going to be a tough one because the way everything's graded, you know, they're designed, you know, basically when we design those, we're just squeezing them in there. And what's likely to happen is that if your detention basin does not already have an overflow on it, they'll probably add one to keep it from flooding the houses around there. But what's going to happen is that water is just going to spill out onto the road or wherever it's directed. And we're no longer going to be protecting against the 100-year. It might be the 75-year or the 50-year storm. So, you know, we didn't really think that through when we started doing these detention basins of, you know, what happens in the future if our rainfall keeps going up. That wasn't really a discussion point that happened back in the late 90s when they came up with all these regulations. So, you know, it might be a point where maybe they have to go back and dig some of them deeper, but you're kind of limited by the elevations. So sometimes you can't do that. Another thing is sometimes our detention basins kind of silt in with all the road grime and dirt that washes into them. So they're going to have to go in and dig that out and make sure that it's actually holding the capacity that it should be holding, or that it was like back to the design condition. But as far as just pure retrofitting, it's going to be tough because they're like squished in between houses and roads, and there's not a whole lot you can do there. That's why I'm hoping that when they start thinking about climate change factored in, that they will give a little extra space around the detention basin for it to expand in the future.
If I could just offer maybe a little reflection on your talk here. You know, as I have listened to you, Chris, and learned about, you know, adapting and these issues, I think the majority of people, maybe using myself as an example, think about what we need to do to prevent further damage to the, you know, to the environment, to the climate, right? But it's upon us now, right? Adapting is just kind of a sobering need that we have to do, and we may think here in the Midwest we are somewhat buffered from that, but we're not, as you very well explain here. You know, I have kids who live both on the East Coast and the West Coast, and they live at about sea level, and I think about what this presentation would be for them, right? And how their local impacts there would that's even more sobering. But it's very real here, and it's adapting is when you, I guess, see any discussion about climate is often not talked about, but is an important dynamic here, right? And I think that's what I take away from this, is that it's not just about greenhouse gas reduction and managing waste better, et cetera, et cetera. It is about dealing with this issue that we have right now, right? It's with us.
Definitely, and some communities are forced to deal with it more so up front, those that are having sea level rise, wildfires, those kinds of things. But for us, it's like we're kind of lucky that we have some time to take that deep breath and think about what we want to do to address this problem, because it's not as severe here. But the other flip side of that comes up is when people are going to say they've had enough of the sea level rise and flooding and hurricanes or their house catching on fire, they're going to move somewhere else safer at some point. And if you read a lot of the studies, they're saying that the Midwest is the place that people are going to go. That we have the Great Lakes as fresh drinking water source, which is really important, especially to people coming from drought-stricken areas. So they're expecting, the idea is that the populations are going to eventually kind of migrate back to the Midwest, and then we need to be prepared for that as well. You think about density issues. I know we've talked about the land use plan, but you talk about density issues, and now all of a sudden you're trying to cram more people into the space because you don't really want to encourage urban sprawl, because that creates more problems. But then you've got density issues, and you need to be really careful with that. And so, even the fact that it does impact, like say, our sanitary sewer. If I design a sewer that's only meant to serve 4 houses, and we've got this example in town, but a developer comes in and knocks down the 4 houses and says, I want to put up 12 townhomes in their place. And the city says, okay, that's more tax dollars. But me thinking, hey, I designed that sewer, I don't know if it can handle all the wastewater flow from 12 houses because I designed it for 4. So that's a big concern. And then who pays for upsizing that if we need to make the pipe bigger, right? I mean, the developers always don't, they're like, well, I don't want to pay for that. That's the city's problem. So there's a lot of issues that we have to think through. And, we need people who are thinking about these issues. And, for me, coming into stormwater management just after I got started, it was basically like we're trying to fix all the issues that the development in the 60s and 70s and 80s caused because there were no ordinances. So now we got to the point where like, okay, now, whatever we were doing before didn't work out too well. And so now we have to do these things. And so now that we already are comfortable doing those, I think we need to start thinking ahead and saying, what are people who are working in 25, plus years going to look back and say about what we did today? Like, wow, they didn't plan or think about this at all. And so I don't want that to be the situation. I want them to say, oh, wow, they thought about this and they said, let's give this a little space, or let's upsize this so we won't have these problems. And so often we just see a lot of communities spending so much money on stormwater improvement plans, like millions of dollars. And then it's like they're just trying to play catch up, fix the problems. But in the meantime, the problems keep coming because the rain keeps coming, and the rainfall is getting heavier and more amount, increased amount. So I feel like now's the time. If we're going to rip something up and build it, let's just build it right. Let's just build it so when it's still in the ground in 50 or 75 years, it's still working. So that's my main point for people to take away is let's build it right, and let's use all that money that's out there that's coming our way to build it the right way.
With that money, I'll just add this little reflection also that it was after one of the big Houston floods. I think, I don't know if it was the latest one or the one prior. They've had several now. That there was. It might have even been after Hurricane Katrina, but there was a Dutch hydrologist, one who was responsible for stormwater management and, the infrastructure in the Netherlands, which is largely under sea level, below sea level, on what should we do. And he was astonished that he kept being asked what we can do to react faster and better when these things happen. When he says the design criteria in the Netherlands with some very finite, tight tolerances is to never have the flood. That is his, where he goes. And I remember my parents are immigrants from the Netherlands. I've been there many times. And I remember as a kid going to see the Delta Works, which is a major flood control project that was done started after the 1953 terrible floods in the Netherlands, perfect storm of weather that flooded much of the country that both my parents had to live through. And seeing that and, so anyway, I agree with you. And I think we all need to have a little bit more Dutch in us. How's that? Should we just stay with?
That sounds good. We need to, if we could adopt those 10,000 year storm events that they designed to, that might help us out. But, I think we haven't updated our rainfall in so long, and then we have these outdated design requirements, and that gets us into a lot of trouble, especially, like in Texas, and no one really, they didn't really think about getting like 50+ inches of rain when they designed those storm sewers and those reservoirs. So I think we need to think a little bit more about those big what ifs and, be prepared for them. We can't always design our way out of those because it can be really expensive. And that's why at some point you kind of go to here's the time to evacuate. And when, the National Weather Service tells you it's going to be bad and you better get out, like you should really listen to them. Because there's a limitation to what we can design for, because if we built everything to this really high standard, it would just be really expensive. So we have to figure out what do we compromise on and where that standard is in relation to cost too. So thank you guys.
All right. Yes, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Was wonderful.